long before American settlement reshaped California's identity. Sebastián Vizcaíno sailed north along a coastline that existed more as rumor than certainty on European maps. The Pacific stretched endlessly beside him, its shifting fog turning cliffs and bays into fleeting silhouettes that challenged even the most disciplined navigator. Spanish ambitions reached toward Asia through New Spain, yet the northern coast remained a fragile line sketched by earlier explorers who had rarely lingered long enough to understand its rhythm. Vizcaíno's expedition carried not only sailors but cartographers, priests, and soldiers, each representing an empire seeking to anchor itself to distant shores. Early charts showed California as a vague edge rather than a defined land, reflecting how imagination often filled the gaps left by incomplete exploration. Ships moved slowly against coastal winds, forcing the crew to learn patience as they measured distance by stars rather than landmarks. The expedition's purpose extended beyond discovery, aiming to identify harbors that could support Spain's trans-Pacific trade routes between Mexico and the Philippines. Sailors described towering cliffs and hidden coves that appeared suddenly through mist, revealing a coastline shaped by quiet grandeur rather than dramatic conquest. Indigenous villagers watched from the shore, their presence reminding explorers that these lands held deep histories long before European arrival. Vizcaíno recorded careful observations, understanding that names placed on maps would influence future journeys as much as any physical landmark. The expedition moved northward cautiously, stopping at sheltered bays to replenish water and repair ships strained by ocean currents. Each anchorage became a moment of negotiation between survival and ambition, as crews balanced exploration with the realities of weather and fatigue. The Pacific's calm mornings often gave way to sudden winds, teaching navigators to read the sea as a living force rather than a passive route. Vizcaíno's charts began to fill with detail, transforming empty space into recognizable geography that future generations would inherit. The naming of places became an act of power, turning unfamiliar landscapes into parts of a distant empire's imagination. Sailors gathered on deck at sunset to watch seabirds circle above rugged headlands, sensing they were witnessing a coast few Europeans had seen clearly before. Fog rolled across the ocean like drifting curtains, obscuring the horizon and forcing navigators to rely on instinct shaped by years at sea. The expedition's priests conducted ceremonies at new anchorages, blending faith with exploration in ways that reflected Spain's broader mission. Vizcaíno's leadership emphasized observation over haste, recognizing that careful mapping could define the success of the voyage more than distance traveled. The coastline revealed a rhythm of bays, cliffs, and estuaries that challenged earlier assumptions about California's geography. As the ships approached what would become Monterey Bay, the crew sensed they had found a harbor capable of shaping future settlements. Vizcaíno's detailed descriptions captured not only physical features but the emotional atmosphere of a place shaped by silence and scale. The expedition paused to repair masts and sails, demonstrating how exploration depended on maintenance as much as courage. Indigenous encounters remained cautious and complex, marked by curiosity rather than immediate conflict. Cartographers worked late into the night, translating observations into lines that would endure far beyond the voyage itself. Vizcaíno named ports and landmarks with deliberate care, embedding Spanish identity into a landscape already rich with indigenous meaning. The naming of Monterey signaled a moment when imagination and geography merged, creating a reference point that would echo through centuries. Sailors believed they were charting a future route for empire, unaware that their maps would later guide explorers from many nations. The expedition's progress felt slow yet purposeful, reflecting the Terra Stories' truth that exploration often unfolds through patience rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Waves struck the hull rhythmically, reminding the crew that the ocean itself dictated the pace of history along this distant coast. Vizcaíno's journals captured the interplay between hope and uncertainty that defined early Pacific exploration. The ships continued northward, driven by ambition to map a coastline that seemed to stretch endlessly into fog. Each new bay transformed blank space on maps into a tangible memory shared by the crew. Spanish banners raised briefly on shore symbolized claims that would shape political narratives long after the expedition ended. The crew faced cold winds and unpredictable currents, learning that California's beauty often concealed danger. Vizcaíno's careful observations distinguished his voyage from earlier expeditions that had passed too quickly to understand the land. The expedition balanced scientific curiosity with imperial expectation, revealing how exploration and ambition intertwined. As autumn approached, the Pacific's light softened, casting golden reflections across waters that would soon appear on European charts. Vizcaíno realized that the act of mapping transformed the unknown into a story others could follow. And in that quiet process of naming and charting, the California coast began to shift from rumor into reality, opening a path that would reshape the future long before settlers arrived. As Vizcaíno's ships moved deeper along the California coastline, the expedition began to recognize that each harbor held the potential to reshape Spain's vision of the Pacific world. The sailors measured depth with weighted lines, listening for the faint sound of lead touching sand as proof that a bay could shelter future fleets. Monterey Bay revealed itself gradually through morning fog, its wide crescent shoreline appearing less like a discovery and more like a promise waiting quietly for recognition. Vizcaíno described the harbor with deliberate precision, noting wind patterns, freshwater sources, and anchorage depth that distinguished it from earlier reports by explorers who had underestimated its value. The naming of Monterey became an act that blended imperial ambition with personal legacy, embedding Spanish identity into a coastline already alive with indigenous meaning. Cartographers sketched the harbor's outline carefully, transforming waves and cliffs into enduring shapes that would guide ships centuries later. The expedition's priests held ceremonies on shore, linking exploration with faith, while the crew repaired sails torn by relentless coastal winds. Indigenous communities observed cautiously from a distance, their presence reminding explorers that every new name layered over older histories rooted in the land. Vizcaíno's journals reflected admiration for the region's calm waters, suggesting that the harbor could serve as a vital stop for Manila galleons crossing the Pacific. Sailors walked beaches scattered with driftwood and shells, sensing the vastness of a coast that felt both inviting and remote. The expedition lingered longer at Monterey than at previous anchorages, recognizing its strategic importance for future voyages. Fog rolled across the bay like a moving wall, forcing navigators to rely on memory and instruments rather than sight alone. Vizcaíno's careful documentation contrasted with earlier expeditions that had rushed northward without understanding the geography they passed. Crew members collected samples of soil and plants, believing they were witnessing the beginnings of future settlements. The Pacific's shifting currents shaped daily routines, reminding sailors that exploration demanded constant adaptation. Maps grew more detailed with each passing day, turning blank space into a network of bays and capes that revealed California's true complexity. Vizcaíno renamed several landmarks in honor of Spanish officials and saints, reinforcing the connection between empire and geography. The expedition's slow pace reflected the Terra Stories' truth that careful observation often defines the success of exploration more than distance traveled. Sailors described the coastline as a place where cliffs rose suddenly from the sea, creating natural defenses that would influence future settlements. Nights at anchor brought moments of reflection as lantern light shimmered across calm water, contrasting with the uncertainty of the open ocean beyond. Vizcaíno compared Monterey's harbor favorably to others along the route, emphasizing its potential as a northern anchor for Spain's Pacific ambitions. Cartographers translated spoken observations into maps that would circulate through colonial courts and influence decisions far from the coast itself. The expedition's presence marked a turning point in how California appeared on European charts, shifting from vague outline to defined territory. Indigenous encounters remained complex and cautious, reflecting a meeting of worlds shaped by curiosity and misunderstanding. Vizcaíno's ships prepared to continue northward, driven by a desire to complete a coastal map that stretched beyond known boundaries. The naming of additional ports created a chain of reference points that would guide future navigators through fog and unfamiliar currents. Sailors recorded the flight of seabirds and patterns of kelp, using natural signs to interpret hidden shoals and safe passages. The expedition's progress felt slow yet transformative, revealing how exploration reshapes perception long before it alters settlement. Vizcaíno's leadership balanced imperial expectation with practical navigation, ensuring that mapping remained the voyage's central purpose. The Pacific's silence often settled over the ships at dusk, allowing crew members to contemplate the scale of the land they were charting. Each new bay added weight to Vizcaíno's legacy, turning personal observation into geographic permanence. Reports prepared for the Spanish crown emphasized Monterey's beauty and strategic value, encouraging future interest in the region. The expedition's maps began to circulate among navigators even before the voyage ended, shaping the imagination of explorers who had never seen the coast themselves. Vizcaíno's descriptions transformed California from a distant rumor into a navigable reality within imperial planning. As winter approached, colder winds forced the crew to consider turning southward, acknowledging the limits of endurance along the northern coast. The expedition prepared to retrace its route, carrying charts that would influence exploration for generations. Sailors looked back at Monterey's quiet shoreline, sensing they had marked a place destined to become more than a temporary anchorage. The act of naming and mapping revealed itself as a subtle form of conquest, reshaping perception long before settlements appeared. Vizcaíno's voyage demonstrated that geography could become destiny when translated into maps carried across oceans. And as the ships turned south with winter clouds gathering, the California coast no longer felt unknown, but transformed into a story waiting for others to continue. Vizcaíno's expedition turned southward. The maps created during the journey began to hold greater significance than the ships themselves. Cartographers worked carefully to refine coastlines traced from memory, translating cliffs and bays into permanent lines of ink. These charts transformed California from an uncertain edge into a recognizable geography that future explorers could follow. Sailors who once measured distance by stars now measured success by the clarity of drawn harbors and named capes. Vizcaíno's notes described wind patterns and currents, revealing how knowledge gathered slowly at sea shaped imperial strategy on land. The expedition's legacy rested not in conquest, but in observation, turning navigation into a quiet act of influence. Spanish officials in New Spain studied the maps with interest, imagining new trade routes anchored by safe harbors along the northern coast. Monterey appeared on charts as a place of promise, its calm waters suggesting a future settlement long before one existed. Indigenous landscapes became European reference points through the act of naming, illustrating how maps reshape perception. Vizcaíno's voyage blurred the line between exploration and administration, because every recorded bay hinted at future governance. The Pacific's vastness receded slightly as maps provided structure to an ocean once defined by uncertainty. Sailors returned to familiar ports carrying stories that elevated California's reputation within Spanish colonial imagination. The expedition's journals circulated among navigators, influencing voyages that would follow decades later. Vizcaíno's detailed observations distinguished his charts from earlier, incomplete attempts to map the region. The coastline's rhythm of cliffs and coves became a narrative told through ink rather than voice. Spanish courts debated the strategic importance of the newly charted harbors, weighing resources against distance. Vizcaíno's legacy began to grow quietly within archives, shaping decisions made by individuals who never met him. The act of mapping turned memory into authority, giving his voyage influence far beyond its immediate moment. Sailors who had endured fog and cold winds recognized that their efforts would guide future journeys through safer waters. Maps drawn from the expedition bridged worlds between indigenous landscapes and imperial ambition. The Pacific coast slowly entered European awareness as a place defined by harbors rather than mystery. Vizcaíno's charts emphasized continuity of coastline, correcting earlier misconceptions about California's geography. The voyage demonstrated that exploration often shapes history through documentation rather than dramatic discovery. Scholars in New Spain began referencing Monterey and other named locations as if they had always existed on maps. Cartographers refined details repeatedly, understanding that accuracy determined survival at sea. Vizcaíno's influence extended quietly through navigation manuals used by later explorers. The coastline he described became a framework for Spanish Pacific strategy. Sailors reflected on how quickly unfamiliar landscapes could become known through careful observation. The expedition's legacy revealed how maps carry stories across generations. Vizcaíno's journey marked a turning point where California shifted from rumor to navigational reality. Imperial planners imagined missions and ports that would not appear until centuries later. The act of naming transformed personal experience into collective memory. Charts reached Europe slowly, altering perceptions of the Pacific world. Vizcaíno's lines on parchment guided ships long after his own voyage ended. The expedition demonstrated that geography becomes power when translated into knowledge. Sailors who returned to New Spain carried memories that blended hardship with quiet pride. Maps stored in archives waited patiently for the next generation to rediscover them. Vizcaíno's work became a bridge between early exploration and later settlement. California's coastline began to exist as both landscape and ideas shaped by ink. And in that quiet transformation, The voyage revealed that exploration often continues long after the ships return home. Despite Vizcaíno's detailed maps, California remained largely untouched by Spanish settlement for generations. Political priorities shifted southward, leaving the northern coast as a distant memory, preserved mainly in archive. Monterey existed on paper long before it existed as a mission or presidio. Navigators occasionally referenced Vizcaíno's charts, yet few returned immediately to the harbors he described. The Pacific's vastness continued to isolate California from imperial focus. Indigenous communities lived along the coast largely unchanged by the maps drawn far away. Vizcaíno's legacy rested quietly within libraries, waiting for a moment when empire would look north again. Spanish Manila galleons passed offshore but rarely anchored at the harbors, he praised. Scholars debated the accuracy of his descriptions, revealing how memory evolves when not reinforced by presence. The coastline remained a frontier between imagination and reality. Vizcaíno's charts inspired curiosity even among explorers from rival nations. Rumors circulated that California might be an island, reflecting confusion born from incomplete exploration. Maps changed slowly as new voyagers added fragments of information. Vizcaíno's names persisted even when political interest faded. Monterey's reputation endured as a harbor waiting for rediscovery. The silence that followed his voyage illustrated how exploration sometimes precedes action by decades. Spanish authorities debated whether northern expansion justified the cost. Vizcaíno's legacy became a quiet thread connecting different eras of exploration. His voyage stood as proof that mapping can precede settlement by generations. The coastline existed as both promise and uncertainty. Indigenous landscapes remained vibrant and independent of European narratives. Vizcaíno's lines on maps waited for history to catch up. The Pacific continued shaping California's identity through isolation. Cartographers revisited his work, refining coastlines with new information. Monterey appeared repeatedly in navigation texts despite the absence of permanent settlement. Vizcaíno's influence lingered in the background of colonial planning. The coast he mapped remained largely unchanged by European presence. Exploration entered a quiet pause that lasted more than a century. Scholars revisiting old charts rediscovered the accuracy of his observations. Vizcaíno's journey became a reference point for later explorers seeking guidance. The idea of California continued evolving through speculation. His maps bridged the gap between early Spanish exploration and future colonial expansion. The coastline's story unfolded slowly, shaped by time rather than immediate transformation. Vizcaíno's legacy revealed how history sometimes moves in long intervals. The harbors he named waited patiently for new arrivals. California remained distant, yet quietly present within imperial imagination. Maps preserved memory even when people forgot the voyage itself. Vizcaíno's work survived because geography endures longer than ambition. The coastline's future remained uncertain, yet inevitable. And in that long silence, the maps continued guiding unseen journeys. More than a century after Vizcaíno's voyage, Spanish expansion returned northward, guided by the maps he created. Explorers searching for suitable mission sites rediscovered Monterey exactly where his charts placed it. The harbor once described in journals became the foundation for future settlement. Spanish missionaries and soldiers followed routes shaped by his observations. Vizcaíno's names appeared again on official documents as empire renewed its interest in California. Monterey transformed from a mapped harbor into a colonial center. His charts proved remarkably accurate, reinforcing the value of careful observation. The coastline he described became part of a network linking missions and presidios. Spanish planners recognized that exploration carried influence long beyond a single lifetime. Vizcaíno's legacy emerged quietly through decisions made generations later. Settlers arrived guided by maps drawn before their ancestors were born. The Pacific coast shifted from frontier to strategic territory. Vizcaíno's voyage bridged two eras of Spanish expansion. The naming of ports shaped cultural identity within the region. Monterey's establishment validated his earlier praise of the harbor. Trade routes expanded northward along paths he documented. The coastline's transformation reflected the slow unfolding of imperial vision. Vizcaíno's maps influenced explorers beyond Spain, shaping international awareness of California. The harbors he named became landmarks for ships from many nations. His legacy moved from archives into living geography. Settlements rose near bays he first described through fog and uncertainty. Indigenous communities encountered new pressures as colonial expansion advanced. Vizcaíno's journey became part of a broader narrative of Pacific exploration. The coastline he mapped gained new meaning through settlement. Spanish authorities recognized his voyage as a turning point in California's history. Mission bells echoed across landscapes once known only through his journals. The act of naming continued shaping identity centuries later. Vizcaíno's charts bridged worlds between exploration and colonization. The Pacific coast evolved into a cultural frontier shaped by many influences. His legacy illustrated how maps guide history long after explorers disappear. Monterey's growth symbolized the fulfillment of his vision. Trade networks expanded along the routes he charted. California entered global awareness through geography first defined by his voyage. Vizcaíno's influence extended quietly into future centuries. The coastline's transformation reflected the power of careful observation. Settlements built upon his maps reshaped the region's future. His journey demonstrated that exploration often becomes visible only in hindsight. The harbors he named connected past and present. Vizcaíno's legacy continued guiding ships across the Pacific. And through those journeys, the coast he mapped became a living story rather than a distant line on parchment. As centuries passed, California's identity changed repeatedly while Vizcaíno's names endured along its shoreline. Spanish rule gave way to new powers, yet the harbors he charted remained constant points of reference. Monterey grew into a cultural and political center shaped by layers of history. Explorers from different nations followed routes first clarified by his voyage. Maps evolved, but many retained the framework established by Vizcaíno's observations. The coastline became a meeting place between indigenous heritage and colonial legacy. Vizcaíno's influence extended beyond Spain into the broader story of Pacific exploration. Sailors navigating modern charts still traced lines first drawn during his expedition. The Pacific remained vast, yet no longer felt unknown. California transformed into a region shaped by migration and innovation. Vizcaíno's role faded into history even as his work continued guiding geography. Scholars revisited his journals to understand early encounters along the coast. His maps revealed a perspective shaped by patience and observation rather than conquest. The coastline he described evolved into cities and ports that carried global significance. Monterey's legacy connected past exploration with modern identity. Vizcaíno's voyage demonstrated how naming can shape cultural memory. The Pacific's rhythms remained unchanged despite political transformation. Coastal landscapes preserved traces of earlier exploration. Vizcaíno's influence became a quiet thread linking centuries of history. The harbors he charted welcomed ships from across the world. His maps bridged eras from Spanish Empire to modern California. The coastline continued evolving through migration and trade. Vizcaíno's legacy reflected the enduring power of exploration. The Pacific world expanded far beyond the ambitions of his expedition. His charts remained symbols of careful observation. California's identity grew into something larger than any single voyage. Scholars described his journey as a foundation for later exploration. The coastline's transformation reflected centuries of cultural exchange. Vizcaíno's name persisted quietly in historical narratives. The Pacific's horizon remained a reminder of journeys yet to come. His expedition demonstrated that exploration often shapes the future indirectly. The harbors he named continued influencing maritime routes. California's story expanded beyond empire into global significance. Vizcaíno's legacy endured through geography itself. The coastline became a symbol of continuity across change. Maps evolve, yet their foundations remain tied to his observations. The Pacific carried echoes of his voyage through time. His work revealed how patience and precision define lasting exploration. The coast he mapped became a place where history and present converged. And through that convergence, Vizcaíno's journey continued shaping the world quietly. Sebastián Vizcaíno did not build cities or command armies, yet his maps shaped a coastline that would influence centuries of history. The harbors he named became anchors for exploration, trade, and settlement long after his ships vanished beyond the horizon. California's identity evolved through many cultures, yet his lines on parchment remained a constant thread. Vizcaíno's voyage revealed that mapping can alter destiny without immediate transformation. The Pacific coast he described became a meeting point between worlds connected by water and memory. Monterey's quiet shoreline carried echoes of a moment when observation turned into legacy. His journey bridged imagination and geography, transforming rumor into reality. Scholars studying early exploration recognize his work as a foundation for later expansion. The coastline stands today as a reminder that history often begins with careful attention rather than conquest. Vizcaíno's charts reveal the power of naming to shape perception across generations. Sailors who followed his routes carried forward a story begun centuries earlier. California's transformation into a global region traces back to voyages defined by patience. His expedition demonstrated that exploration leaves marks not only on maps but on identity itself. The Pacific's calm waters reflect a past shaped by quiet determination. Vizcaíno's legacy reminds us that history unfolds slowly, guided by those who observe as much as those who act. The harbors he mapped continue welcoming travelers from across the world. His voyage transformed the unknown into a shared narrative carried through generations. The coastline remains both landscape and memory shaped by his journey. Vizcaíno's work bridged cultures long before borders defined the region. The Pacific continues flowing past cliffs he once described in careful detail. California's story expanded beyond empire into a place shaped by many voices. His maps became a foundation for understanding a coast that once existed only in rumor. The names he gave endure as quiet echoes of a distant voyage. Exploration, in his case, meant listening to wind, wave, and shoreline rather than seeking spectacle. The Terra Stories truth appears here as well, that history's turning points often arrive gently. Vizcaíno's legacy lives in geography more than in monuments. Travelers standing along Monterey Bay today witness a landscape first described through fog and patience. The coast he mapped remains a bridge between past and present. His journey shows that knowledge travels farther than ships. California continues evolving, yet the foundation of its mapped identity endures. Vizcaíno's voyage connects centuries through the quiet act of naming. The Pacific horizon still invites exploration, just as it did during his time. His maps remind us that observation shapes the future long before change becomes visible. The coastline he charted became a story shared by many cultures, and in that shared story, his presence remains subtle yet lasting. History grows quieter as we step away from the decks of his ships and toward the modern shore. Thank you for walking through this journey along California's earliest mapped horizon. If these quiet stories continue to travel with you, consider returning for the next path where exploration reshaped the world. The sea remains wide, the coast remains patient, and the past waits gently beside every wave. Until the next story, may history stay close like a harbor once named in silence, still guiding those who follow the map.